She was fired from the ranch for saving a horse. But what happened the next morning would make everyone question everything they thought they knew about loyalty. The rain hammered the wooden roof of the stable like bullets, each drop echoing through the darkness. Clara pressed her back against the barn wall, her heart pounding as she watched Foreman Hayes pace back and forth, his boots splashing through the muddy puddles. His face was twisted with rage, veins bulging from his thick neck. "You defied a direct order," Hayes snarled, pointing his finger at her chest. "I told you to leave that horse. It's worthless. Lame leg, bad bloodline, not worth the feed we'd waste on it." Clara's hands trembled, but not from fear. The anger burned hot in her chest as she thought about the young stallion lying in the stall behind her, his leg wrapped in makeshift bandages she'd torn from her own shirt. She'd found him during the storm, trapped under a fallen branch, eyes wild with pain and terror. While Hayes had ordered the men to leave the animal to die, Clara had stayed behind. "That horse can heal," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Give him time, and he'll run again." Hayes laughed, a cruel sound that made her skin crawl. "Time? Feed? Medicine? You think Morrison pays us to run a charity for broken animals?" He stepped closer, his breath reeking of whiskey. "You've been trouble since the day you arrived here, girl. Always thinking you know better than the men who've been working cattle since before you were born." The other ranch hands stood in the shadows, watching the confrontation unfold. None of them met her eyes. Clara had worked alongside these men for 3 years, breaking horses that others called unrideable, tending wounds that others said were hopeless. But now, when Hayes raised his voice, they all looked away. "Pack your things," Hayes continued, his voice growing louder. "You're done here, tonight. I want you off Morrison's land before sunrise." Clara felt her world crumble. This ranch wasn't just her job, it was her home. The small room above the stable, the horses she'd trained from colts, the land she'd walked every morning at dawn. Everything she'd built, everything she'd worked for, destroyed because she couldn't watch an innocent animal suffer. "The storm's not over," she said desperately. "At least let me wait until morning." "No." Hayes stepped back and crossed his arms. "You made your choice when you decided that Broken Horse was more important than following orders. Now live with the consequences." Thunder crashed overhead, shaking the barn walls. Clara looked once more at the stall where the injured stallion lay, his dark eyes watching her with an intelligence that seemed almost human. She'd wrapped his wounds, whispered comfort to him through his pain, promised him he'd survive. Now she was being forced to abandon him to a man who saw animals as nothing more than profit and loss. She gathered her few possessions, a worn saddle, some clothes, her father's old horsebrush, and stuffed them into a canvas bag. The rain had turned the yard into a sea of mud, and her boots sank deep with each step toward the ranch gate. Behind her, she could hear Hayes shouting orders to secure the barn for the night. As Clara reached the edge of Morrison's property, she turned back one last time. The ranch house sat dark against the stormy sky, and she could barely make out the outline of the stable where she'd spent the best years of her life. She thought about the stallion lying injured and alone, and wondered if Hayes would even bother to feed him come morning. But as she stood there in the pouring rain, something strange happened. Through the thunder and wind, she heard it, a sound that made no sense. The soft whinny of horses coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond the ranch. Not just one or two, but many. Their voices carried on the wind like a song, low and mournful, as if they were calling to her. Clara shook her head, convinced the storm was playing tricks on her mind. She pulled her coat tighter and started walking into the night, not knowing that by sunrise, everything would change. What she didn't realize was that word travels fast among creatures who understand loyalty better than men, and some debts can only be paid in ways that human minds struggle to comprehend. Clara found shelter under a rocky overhang about a mile from the ranch, her clothes soaked through and her teeth chattering from the cold. She wrapped her coat around her shoulders and tried to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the injured stallion's face, heard Hayes's cruel laughter echoing in her mind. The storm began to weaken as the hours passed, the thunder growing distant and the rain softening to a steady drizzle. But something else was happening in the darkness around her, something that made the hair on her arms stand up. She could hear movement in the brush, the soft sound of hooves on wet ground, growing closer with each passing minute. At first, she thought it might be wolves or other predators drawn by her scent. Clara reached for the small knife at her belt, her heart racing as she peered into the blackness beyond her rocky shelter. But then she heard it again, that same gentle whinnying she'd noticed at the ranch, only now it was all around her, coming from every direction. A flash of lightning illuminated the landscape for a brief moment, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. Silhouettes of horses dotted the hillside, standing motionless in the rain like stone statues. When darkness returned, she convinced herself it had been her imagination, a trick of shadow and storm. But then another lightning flash revealed even more shapes. Closer now, forming a loose circle around her hiding place. "What in God's name?" she whispered, pressing herself back against the cold rock. The horses made no aggressive moves toward her. They simply stood there, silent sentinels in the night, their presence both comforting and mysterious. Clara had worked with horses her entire life, but she'd never seen anything like this. Wild horses typically avoided humans, especially during storms when their instincts told them to seek their own shelter. As the rain continued to fade, Clara could make out more details in the dim pre-dawn light. These weren't just wild mustangs. She recognized some of them. There was Copper, the old gelding from the Henderson Ranch 5 miles south. Thunder, the black mare from the Miller place. Even Duchess, the prized Arabian that belonged to the wealthy banker in town. Horses that had never met, from properties scattered across the entire valley, all gathered here in this unlikely place. But what troubled Clara most was how they'd gotten here. These animals had broken free from corrals, jumped fences, wandered away from their usual grazing areas. Some had traveled impossible distances in the middle of a violent storm. It made no sense, defied everything she knew about horse behavior. She stood slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. The nearest horse, a young chestnut with a white blaze, turned its head toward her. In its dark eyes, she saw something that made her heart skip. Recognition. Not the recognition of a trained animal seeing its owner, but something deeper. Something that seemed to say, "We know what you did. We know why you're here." Clara took a tentative step forward, extending her hand toward the chestnut. The horse didn't shy away. Instead, it moved closer, allowing her to touch its neck. The animal's coat was warm despite the rain, and she could feel its steady heartbeat under her palm. One by one, other horses began to approach, forming a tighter circle around her. She counted them as they emerged from the shadows. 20, 30, 50. More kept appearing from behind rocks and trees, their hoofbeats creating a rhythm like distant drums. Clara had never seen so many horses together outside of a major roundup, and certainly never in circumstances like these. The eastern horizon began to show the first pale hints of dawn, and Clara realized she needed to make a decision. She couldn't stay here forever, exposed on the hillside with this strange gathering of animals, but she also couldn't bring herself to leave them. Something about their presence felt important, though she couldn't understand what. As if sensing her uncertainty, the horses began to move, not away from her, but with her, forming loose lines on either side as she started walking. Clara found herself at the center of a slow procession heading back toward Morrison's ranch. She tried to veer away, to lead them in a different direction, but they gently but firmly guided her path. "Where are you taking me?" she asked aloud, feeling foolish for talking to animals who couldn't answer. But perhaps they could answer, in their own way. Because as the sun began to rise over the valley, casting long shadows across the grassland, Clara could see their destination clearly. They were heading directly back to the ranch where she'd been humiliated and cast out just hours before. And they weren't alone anymore. More horses were joining them from every direction, emerging from ravines and meadows, descending from the hills like a great tide of living creatures. Clara stopped counting at 100, her mind struggling to process what was happening around her. Whatever this was, whatever force had drawn these animals together, it was bigger than anything she'd ever witnessed, and somehow, she was at the center of it all. By the time Clara and her mysterious escort reached the valley floor, the sun had fully risen, painting the grassland in shades of gold and amber. What she saw ahead made her stomach drop. Morrison's ranch lay spread out before them, but something was terribly wrong. Smoke rose from the stable area, and she could hear men shouting over the sound of panicked animals. The horses around her seemed to sense the distress too. Their ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as they caught scents carried on the morning breeze. The chestnut mare beside Clara whinnied softly, a sound that was somehow both mournful and determined. As they drew closer, Clara could see ranch hands running back and forth between the buildings, their faces tight with worry. Foreman Hayes stood in the center of the chaos, barking orders and waving his arms. Even from a distance, she could see the fury radiating from his thick frame. "The stable's on fire," Clara breathed, her heart racing. She thought immediately of the injured stallion she'd been forced to leave behind. Was he still alive? Could the men even reach him through the smoke and flames? But as they approached the ranch perimeter, Clara realized the smoke wasn't coming from a fire at all. It was dust, massive clouds of it being kicked up by hundreds of hooves. The ranch's own horses had broken free during the night, and they were running wild through the property, destroying everything in their path. Fences lay trampled, water troughs overturned, feed scattered across the ground like confetti. Hayes spotted her approaching with the vast herd behind her, and his face went white. He stumbled backward, nearly falling over a broken fence post as his eyes took in the impossible sight. 200 horses, maybe more, moving in perfect formation with the woman he'd fired just hours before, walking calmly in their midst. "What the hell is this?" Hayes shouted. Hayes, his voice cracking with disbelief. Clara felt just as confused as he looked. She had no explanation for what was happening, no understanding of why these animals had chosen to follow her back to this place. All she knew was that something profound was unfolding, something that made her skin prickle with electricity. The horses began to spread out as they entered the ranch proper, but they didn't scatter randomly as wild animals should. Instead, they formed deliberate lines, creating a corridor that led directly to the damaged stable. Clara found herself walking down this living pathway, feeling both protected and terrified by the power surrounding her. Ranch hands pressed themselves against buildings and climbed onto fence posts, staring in wonder and fear at the massive gathering. Some whispered prayers, others clutched their hats to their chests as if witnessing something sacred. The normal sounds of a working ranch, the clank of metal, the creak of leather, the casual chatter of men, had fallen completely silent. Hayes tried to regain control of the situation, shouting orders that no one seemed to hear. His authority, so absolute just hours before, now seemed meaningless in the face of this natural phenomenon. Clara could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. As she reached the stable entrance, Clara heard a familiar sound that made her heart leap. The injured stallion was calling to her from inside, his voice weak but unmistakably alive. She looked toward the stable door, then back at the sea of horses surrounding her. They were waiting for something. All of them, wild and tame alike, stood perfectly still as if holding their breath. Clara realized with growing amazement that they were waiting for her to act, to make some decision that would determine what happened next. But before she could move, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed from the main road. A single rider was coming fast, kicking up his own cloud of dust as he raced toward the ranch. Clara shaded her eyes and felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the expensive black coat and silver-trimmed saddle. Morrison himself was returning home, and he was about to witness something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the natural world. Morrison's horse reared up as he reached the edge of his property, the animal spooked by the unprecedented sight before them. The rancher fought to control his mount, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, disbelief, and growing anger as he took in the destruction scattered across his land. "Hayes!" Morrison's voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. "What in the name of all that's holy is happening to my ranch?" Foreman Hayes stumbled forward, his usual confidence completely shattered. He opened his mouth several times before any words came out, gesturing helplessly at the massive gathering of horses that had somehow materialized overnight. "Sir, the horses, she came back with them," Hayes stammered, pointing an accusatory finger at Clara. "The woman I fired last night for insubordination. She's brought some kind of curse on the place." Morrison's eyes found Clara standing in the center of the equine assembly, and his expression hardened. He'd built his wealth by controlling every aspect of his business, every animal, every employee, every dollar that passed through his hands. What he saw before him represented chaos, the complete breakdown of the order he'd spent years establishing. "You," Morrison said, dismounting and stalking toward Clara. "I don't know what trickery you've employed here, but you're going to call off these animals and get them off my land immediately." Clara felt her anger flare at his tone, the same dismissive arrogance she'd heard from Hayes the night before. These men saw the world only in terms of what could be bought, sold, or controlled. They had no understanding of the deeper connections that existed between living creatures. "They're not tricks," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "And they're not following my orders. They came on their own." Morrison scoffed, pulling leather gloves from his belt. "Horses don't behave this way. Animals don't organize themselves into formations and march across the countryside without human direction. You've trained them somehow, used some method to—" His words were cut off by a sound that made everyone freeze. From inside the damaged stable came the clear, strong whinny of the injured stallion Clara had rescued. But this wasn't the weak call of a suffering animal. It was the proud trumpet of a horse that had found its strength again. The stable door, which had been hanging loose on its hinges from the night's chaos, suddenly swung open. The stallion emerged into the morning light, his injured leg bearing his weight without hesitation. The makeshift bandages Clara had applied were gone, and though she could see the faint outline of where the wound had been, the horse moved with perfect grace. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Animals could heal remarkably fast, but not like this. Not overnight. Not from injuries that should have left permanent damage. She watched in amazement as the stallion approached her, his dark eyes holding that same intelligent recognition she'd seen in all the others. The horse touched her shoulder gently with his muzzle, a gesture so tender and deliberate that it brought tears to her eyes. Then he turned to face Morrison and Hayes, his posture proud and challenging. The message was unmistakable. This woman had saved his life, and he had not forgotten. Morrison's face had gone pale. As a man who dealt in livestock, he knew enough about horse injuries to recognize the impossibility of what he was witnessing. The stallion should have been lame for life, if he survived at all. Yet here he stood, healthy and strong, positioned protectively beside the woman his foreman had cast out. "This is impossible," Morrison whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. But the horses around them seemed to disagree. One by one they began to move closer, forming tighter circles around Clara and the stallion. Their movement was synchronized, purposeful, like a living wall of flesh and spirit that radiated unmistakable power. Hayes backed away, his face flushed with fear and embarrassment. "Sir, maybe we should call the sheriff. Or the army. This isn't natural, it's like something out of the old stories." Morrison ignored his foreman, his businessman's mind racing as he tried to calculate the value of what he was seeing. 200 horses, maybe more, many of them prime breeding stock from ranches across the territory. If he could claim ownership somehow, assert some legal right to the animals on his property. But before he could speak, Clara stepped forward, her hand resting on the stallion's neck. The simple gesture seemed to send a signal through the entire herd. As one, they turned their attention to Morrison, and in their collective gaze he saw something that made his blood run cold. These animals were no longer just livestock. They had become something else entirely, something that recognized no human authority, acknowledged no claim of ownership, and at their center stood a woman who had chosen compassion over orders, who had risked everything to save a single injured creature. Morrison realized with growing dread that his next words would determine not just Clara's fate, but the future of his entire operation. Because whatever force had brought these horses together was far more powerful than anything he'd ever encountered. And it was waiting to see what kind of man he truly was. Morrison stood frozen as the weight of 200 equine gazes settled upon him. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft breathing of the massive herd and the distant sound of wind through the grassland. He'd faced down business rivals, weathered financial storms, commanded respect through sheer force of will. But this was different. This was a test he couldn't buy his way out of. Clara watched the rancher's internal struggle play out across his face. She could see him calculating, measuring, trying to find an angle that would restore his control over the situation. But the horses around her remained perfectly still, as if they too were waiting to see what choice he would make. "I don't understand what's happening here," Morrison finally said, his voice quieter than before. "But I can see that these animals, they're not here by accident." Hayes stepped forward, desperation clear in his voice. "Sir, you can't seriously be considering—" "Shut up, Hayes." Morrison's command was sharp enough to make his foreman stumble backward. The rancher's eyes never left Clara's face as he spoke. "Tell me what happened last night. Everything." Clara straightened, feeling the stallion's warm presence beside her lending her strength. "Your foreman ordered me to leave an injured horse to die in the storm. When I refused, he fired me and cast me out into the night. These horses found me, followed me, brought me back here. I don't know why and I don't know how, but I know it means something. Morrison nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to the stallion standing beside her. And this is the animal Hayes wanted left to die? Yes. He said it was worthless, not worth the feed or medicine it would take to heal him. The rancher approached the stallion carefully, his experienced eye taking in the horse's conformation, the intelligence in its eyes, the obvious strength in its frame. This was no ordinary animal. Even Morrison could see that now. The breeding lines, the natural grace, the almost regal bearing, all spoke of exceptional bloodstock. "Hayes," Morrison called without turning around. "How exactly did you determine this horse was worthless?" The foreman's face reddened. "Sir, it had a leg injury. Looked bad. And the bloodlines aren't documented, so there's no registration papers, no proof of, you idiot." Morrison's voice was deadly quiet. "This is a descendant of the Spanish war horses. Look at that arch of neck, the way he carries himself. You nearly let us lose one of the finest animals I've ever seen because you were too lazy to look beyond a superficial injury." Clara felt a flicker of hope, but she forced herself to remain cautious. Morrison was still a businessman first, and she'd seen how quickly his type could change their tune when money was involved. Morrison turned back to face the assembled herd, and Clara saw something shift in his expression. For the first time since his arrival, he looked genuinely humbled by what he was witnessing. "In 30 years of ranching," he said slowly, "I've never seen anything like this. These animals came from dozens of different properties, some from places 50 miles away. They traveled through a storm that should have sent them running for shelter. And they're all here because of what you did for one injured horse." The rancher paused, looking out over the sea of horses that had transformed his property into something resembling a natural amphitheater. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made everyone present lean forward to listen. "I've spent my whole life thinking I understood how to manage livestock, how to run a profitable operation. But what I'm seeing here suggests I've been missing something fundamental about the nature of these animals." Clara's heart began to race as she sensed the direction of his thoughts. But before Morrison could continue, a new sound interrupted the moment, the thunder of approaching hooves from the main road. A group of riders was coming fast, and from their formation and speed, Clara could tell they weren't bringing good news. The horses around her seemed to sense the approaching threat too, their ears pricked forward, and she could feel tension ripple through the herd like electricity. Whatever peace they'd found in this strange gathering was about to be tested by forces beyond anyone's control. The approaching riders materialized through the morning dust, like harbingers of trouble. Clara counted at least a dozen men, all armed, their faces grim with purpose. At their head rode Sheriff Dunbar, his badge glinting in the sunlight, followed by what appeared to be ranchers from across the territory. These were men who'd woken to find their prize animals missing and had followed the trail to Morrison's land. "Morrison!" Sheriff Dunbar called out as the group reined in their horses at the edge of the property. "We need to talk. There's been thievery on a scale I've never seen." The horses surrounding Clara began to shift restlessly, sensing the hostility radiating from the newcomers. Several of the animals she recognized, including Copper from the Henderson Ranch and Thunder from the Miller place, moved closer to her, as if seeking protection. The irony wasn't lost on Clara that horses were looking to her for safety from their own supposed owners. Morrison stepped forward, raising his hands in a gesture meant to calm the situation. "Sheriff, I assure you there's been no theft here. These animals came of their own accord." "Nonsense," barked a red-faced man Clara recognized as Henderson. "Horses don't travel 50 miles in a storm to hold a social gathering. Someone orchestrated this and I want my property returned immediately." Sheriff Dunbar's eyes swept over the massive gathering, his expression growing more troubled by the moment. "Morrison, I've got reports of missing horses from 17 different ranches, all of them traced here. Now I know you're a respected businessman, but this looks mighty suspicious." Clara felt the situation spiraling toward violence. The mounted men were growing more agitated, their hands drifting toward their weapons. The horses around her were responding to the tension, some beginning to paw the ground nervously. If shooting started, the chaos would be unimaginable. "Sheriff," Clara called out, stepping forward despite the risk. "These horses weren't stolen. They came to help." Several of the men laughed harshly at her words. Henderson spat into the dust. "Help? Help with what? And who the hell are you to speak about my animals?" Morrison moved protectively closer to Clara, surprising her with his support. This woman saved an injured horse last night. Somehow, Word of that act seems to have spread among the animals in ways we don't understand. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, said Miller, a thin man with nervous eyes. Animals don't communicate across distances. They don't organize rescue missions. This woman has obviously trained these horses using methods that— His words were cut off by a sound that made every human present fall silent. The injured stallion, still standing beside Clara, had begun to call out, not with the simple whinny of a domestic horse, but with something deeper, more complex. Other horses in the herd began to respond, their voices joining his in what could only be described as a song. The sound was unlike anything Clara had ever heard. It started low and mournful, like grief-given voice, then rose in pitch and complexity until it seemed to fill the entire valley. The horses' calls wove together, creating harmonies that spoke of suffering, loyalty, and hope in ways that transcended human language. Sheriff Dunbar's horse began to tremble beneath him, and Clara saw fear creep into the lawman's eyes. This was beyond his experience, beyond the simple theft case he'd expected to solve. The other mounted men were having similar reactions, their horses growing increasingly agitated as the strange chorus continued. "What in God's name?" Henderson whispered. His bluster completely evaporated. The song reached a crescendo, then gradually faded, leaving in silence that felt heavy with meaning. In that quiet, Clara understood something profound had just occurred. The horses hadn't just been making noise, they'd been telling their story, speaking of neglect, abuse, indifference, of the rare human who showed true compassion, of their choice to honor that compassion in the only way they knew how. Morrison's face had gone pale during the horse's performance, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "They're not just animals, are they? They're something more." Clara nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "They've always been more. We just forgot how to listen." Sheriff Dunbar dismounted slowly, his hand nowhere near his weapon. The authority he'd carried into this confrontation had been stripped away by what he'd witnessed. I can't explain what just happened, but I know it wasn't theft." The other ranchers sat their horses in stunned silence, staring at animals they'd thought they owned, thought they understood. Clara could see the wheels turning in their minds as they grappled with implications that challenged everything they believed about the natural world. But the moment of revelation was interrupted by a new voice, Hayes, who had been conspicuously quiet since the confrontation began. "This is all superstitious nonsense," the foreman declared, his voice shaking with desperate anger. "I won't stand here and listen to grown men act like children afraid of fairy tales. These are livestock, nothing more, and I'll prove it." Before anyone could stop him, Hayes pulled his pistol and aimed it directly at the stallion beside Clara. The threat was clear. If these animals were just property, then destroying one would prove his point. If they were something more, then perhaps his bullet would reveal the truth in ways that words could not. Every horse in the massive herd turned to face Hayes, their collective gaze holding a promise that made the foreman's hand begin to shake. Clara realized with growing terror that the next few seconds would determine not just the stallion's fate, but the future of the relationship between humans and the animals they claimed to control. Time seemed suspended as Hayes held his weapon aimed at the stallion's heart. The foreman's face was flushed with desperation, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. His finger tightened on the trigger, but something in the collective gaze of 200 horses made him hesitate. "Hayes, lower your weapon," Morrison commanded, his voice cutting through the tension like steel. "That's enough." "No, sir," Hayes replied, his voice cracking. "I won't let some female and her tricks destroy everything we've built here. These are just animals, and I'll prove it." But as he spoke, something extraordinary happened. The stallion didn't flee or rear in panic as any normal horse would when facing a gun. Instead, he stepped forward, placing himself directly between Clara and the weapon. His dark eyes never left Hayes's face, and in that gaze was the intelligence so profound that several of the watching men gasped audibly. Sheriff Dunbar found his voice first. "Hayes, I'm ordering you to stand down. There's been enough madness here today." The foreman's hand began to shake more violently. The simple act of intimidation he'd planned had become something far more complex. How do you threaten a creature that shows no fear? How do you assert dominance over something that seems to understand exactly what you're doing and chooses defiance anyway? Clara placed her hand on the stallion's neck, feeling his steady heartbeat beneath her palm. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," she said quietly to Hayes. They're not trying to take anything from you. They're just showing what loyalty looks like. Morrison stepped forward, positioning himself beside Clara and the stallion. Hayes, you're fired. Get off my land. The foreman's eyes widened in shock. Sir, you can't. After everything I've done for this ranch, you nearly let me lose the finest horse I've ever seen because you couldn't see past your own prejudices, Morrison replied firmly. And now you're threatening to kill him because you can't accept that you were wrong. That's not the kind of man I want running my operation. Hayes looked around desperately for support, but found none. The other ranchers were staring at their own horses with new eyes, perhaps seeing for the first time the intelligence and loyalty they'd always taken for granted. Sheriff Dunbar had completely holstered his weapon, his face reflecting a man whose worldview had been fundamentally altered. Slowly, reluctantly, Hayes lowered his gun. The defeat in his posture was complete as he realized that everything he'd believed about power and control had crumbled in a single morning. Morrison turned to face Clara, his expression serious but no longer hostile. I have a proposition for you. I need someone to manage my horses, all of them. Someone who understands them the way you obviously do. The position comes with a house, a good salary, and complete authority over the care of every animal on this ranch. Clara felt her heart soar, but she looked out at the massive herd surrounding them. What about all of these others? They came here for a reason. Morrison smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth she'd seen from him. Any horse that chooses to stay is welcome. Any that wants to return home can go with my blessing. But I suspect many of them have been waiting for someone who would treat them as partners rather than property. As if understanding his words, many of the horses began to move, some heading toward their respective owners, others choosing to remain. The decisions seemed to be made with careful consideration, and Clara realized she was witnessing something unprecedented. Animals choosing their own destinies based on how they'd been treated. Sheriff Dunbar mounted his horse, shaking his head in amazement. I came here to arrest horse thieves and I'm leaving with, well, I don't know what to call it, but it's changed how I think about every animal I've ever known. As the crowd began to disperse, Clara remained surrounded by nearly 50 horses who had chosen to stay. The stallion who had started it all stood beside her, his recovery complete, his loyalty absolute. Morrison extended his hand to her, and she shook it firmly. Welcome to your new life, Clara. Something tells me it's going to be unlike anything either of us has ever experienced. That evening, as the sun set over the valley, Clara stood in the doorway of her new house, watching the horses graze peacefully in the pastures. The stallion approached her, nuzzling her shoulder gently in the gesture that had become their greeting. She thought about the previous night, when she'd lost everything for choosing compassion over orders. Now she had gained something far more valuable, a partnership with creatures who understood loyalty in ways that humans were only beginning to comprehend. The horses had taught everyone present a lesson that would echo through the territory for years to come. True leadership isn't about control or dominance, but about earning trust through kindness, one act of compassion at a time. If you enjoyed this story of loyalty and redemption, please consider subscribing to our channel and leaving a super chat if this story touched your heart. Your support helps us bring more amazing tales from the American frontier to life. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another incredible story of courage, justice, and the unbreakable bonds that can form between humans and the natural world.